Okay. So, New Testament introduction. We just have a couple people here. So give me like, what are, and so obviously we've been talking about the Gospels for a week or so. But just before we get started, it's just three of us. Tell me, I know this is a very broad question, very big, but what are some things you know about the New Testament? If someone were to ask you, let's say someone were to come up to you, they don't know who you are, and they were to just say, hey, I heard of this thing called the New Testament. Do you have any clue what that is? Now, you might just say no and walk away. But let's say you were willing to actually engage with the person. What might you say? Say again?
All I did was that it had truth.
Okay, so there's some stories about Jesus in it.
Does it, I'm not sure this is right, but does it include like the gospel?
Mhm.
The gospel?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, that's correct. So in the Gospels are the stories about Jesus. So the New Testament is that, you might say second half of the Bible, though it's much less than half. Your Old Testament is more like 3/4 of a Bible, of a full Bible, and then the last portion of it is called the New Testament, and it starts with the Gospels, like you said, which are the stories about Jesus, and it follows through. So it's the writings of Jesus's followers, basically. So before we get too far into the New Testament, let's just talk a little bit more about the Old Testament, and I'll remind you of this word, actually, canon, C-A-N-O-N. I'm not talking about a big gun that shoots a large ball and it sits on the side of ships, but it's a word that means like an official set of text, or it doesn't even necessarily have to be text. So again, I know I've said this before, but some people will argue about different Star Wars movies. Is this Star Wars movie official canon? And what they mean is, would George Lucas have approved of like the way that this story was written and told and all that sort of stuff? Same with Game of Thrones. People are like, oh yeah, the last 2 seasons aren't canon because George R.R. Martin didn't write them. So I'm going to be using that word a lot. So in regards to the Bible, it's which books are included in the Bible and which books are not included. So whenever I say canon, that's what I mean. Why is it that whenever I go buy a Bible, there are certain books in there? Because Jews wrote other things. They didn't only write Genesis through Malachi. And then the Christians wrote other things as well. They didn't only write Matthew through Revelation. So why are these things there and the other things not? But that's what's called the canon. Does that make sense? So let's do some Old Testament review. This will be really quick. So remember, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. Oh shoot, I thought I put that in there. 39 or 46, and the discrepancy I will talk about in a second. So it's the Old Testament, depending on your denomination and all that sort of stuff, will either have 39 or 46 books. There are some other names for the Old Testament that are more than just naming conventions. They actually have some meaning to them. So the one that we've talked about a little bit is Tanakh, which is the same thing whenever people talk about the Hebrew Bible. And it's named the Hebrew Bible because it was written in Hebrew. Especially whenever you're doing interreligious dialogue. So whenever Christians, I just got back from the big Bible conference, and the Bible conference is not Christians only. There are, there are lots of Jews there. There are lots of Christians, but then there are lots of people who are not either. And so whenever you're trying to do interreligious dialogue, you're trying to be more sensitive. It'd be insensitive to call it the Old Testament, because that insinuates that that we're past this. Because remember, testament is the word covenant, and so this is the idea of like this is the old covenant. This is the old way of thinking about it. A Jew would never call it the Old Testament. This is the only Bible, and so they call it the Hebrew Bible. Some will also opt for the First Testament. I don't hear that very often, but it does happen. By the way, for those of you who are watching the recording of this, I'll have this behind me, but I'll also upload the PowerPoint so you can follow along. But another name for it is the Septuagint, and Septuagint is abbreviated LXX. I think I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. But what the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So remember, we talked about how as Israel was taken over, the Jews, some of them were spread about, and then some of them stayed locally in modern day Israel. Those who were spread about in the Greek-speaking world, you know, as is common, you know, today, you learn the language of the people around you. So they spoke Greek, a lot of them, and their Greek was probably a whole lot better than their Hebrew, especially since most people didn't even really speak Hebrew colloquially. And so they translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And so it's abbreviated LXX. Which do I talk about why? Can't remember. Oh, I do talk about why in a second, so I'll go back to that. So let's go back to the Tanakh though. We talked about this a bit. The name is an acronym for the 3 sections of the Hebrew Bible. The first is the Torah, which are those first 5 books of the Bible, which Torah is the Hebrew word for law. The second section is the Nevi'im, which is the Hebrew word for the prophets, which they split into 2 sections, the former prophets and the latter prophets. Whenever we talk about the prophets, we tend to only talk about these books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all the minor prophets, which they're only called minor because their books are shorter, but they were actually collected into 1 volume called the Book of the 12. So we tend to only talk about these as the prophets, but actually the Jews today, you know, still, whenever they read their whenever they read their Hebrew Bible, they also call Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Those are also called the prophets. But those are the former prophets versus the latter prophets. And then the Ketuvim, which just includes everything else. I think I have some of this a little bit out of order. I meant to go, but basically you have the poetic books. This would include Song of Solomon as well, or Song of Songs. The Megillot are books that are read during certain festivals. So anyway, what's different about this Bible, the Tanakh, is that it is in a different order than so if you were to go buy a Bible today, a Christian Bible, it's not going to be in this order. It's going to be in a very different order. Not very different, but a fairly different order. But these are the books that are included in it. So you have all the same books, but they're just in a different order. Which brings us to the Septuagint. So this abbreviation LXX, this is the Roman numeral. Did y'all learn those? So the Romans use letters for numbers. So there's the 50, 10, and 10. So it just means the 70. There's a mythical origin of the Septuagint that which comes from the letter of Aristeas, that 70 people all translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek, and they all had it like down to every single word was the same. And so that's where this is the mythical origins of the Septuagint. And so but another thing that they did, it's not just in Greek. So it's not just in Greek, but they also ordered the books differently. Their first section is the Law/Pentateuch, which is the same thing as the Torah. But this word Pentateuch, which you maybe have heard before, I maybe have said it. Again, as far as the collection of books, it's the exact same thing in the exact same order. But the Pentateuch usually refers to the Greek Bible, whenever you're doing these sorts of studies. Next, they put the historical books, which is for us is Joshua through Esther. And so what was before called the former prophets which only went through Second Kings, but now we also include Ruth in there, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, as well as First and Second Chronicles. Wisdom, which are all the poetic books, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and Song of Songs. I think Lamentations is in there too. And then the rest of them, the only reason I didn't put them is because it's the rest of the of our Bibles, like modern Bibles. So that's going to be Isaiah through Malachi, all the prophetic books. So, but another thing that the Septuagint did was it added books. So it added some historical books. That's Tobit, Judith, and First and Second Maccabees. Actually, if you're an Anglican, they're reading Judith right now. It's or they just finished it yesterday. But Tobit and Judith are really beautiful books. Two books of some women saving the day. Then we talked about First and Second Maccabees already. But First and Second Maccabees, just a reminder, is that story of the Jews overtaking the Romans, leading to Judas Maccabeus, leading to their brief history of independence. They added a couple of wisdom books, Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach, one prophetic book called Baruch, which Baruch is a historical figure in the book of Jeremiah. So, you know, this is his book. And there's also some additions to Daniel, several, like three editions, Bell and the Dragon, can't remember the other two. And then there's one edition to Chronicles. It's the letter that's just stuck in the middle of Chronicles. So now let's get to the New Testament. The New Testament. It was written between around, so that's what this little squiggly line means, around 40 to 90 CE, or AD, if you will. So this is the first century. So this can be confusing to some people. I'm gonna just put my markers back in there. So, you know, right now we're in the year 2022, and we call this the 21st century. Not the 20th century. It's the 21st century. And so 40 to 90 is the first century. There is no 0th century. So whenever we talk about the first century, that's, you know, in first century Christians, this is the people who, you know, lived and died in the same time as Jesus. Which, by the way, 40 would be very early, it's possible. But Jesus died approximately 33 AD. And so this would have been potentially only 7 years after he died. So it's written in Greek, but by Jewish authors. So remember when we talked about Judaism splitting, that would mean if they're Jewish, they're writing in Greek, that means it probably reflects diaspora Judaism. But remember also that these were Jews who lived in Judea still. These are those who still lived in modern day Israel. So it also would reflect Jewish Judaism? What's the other word? Palestinian Judaism. But they're usually referring to the Septuagint. Oh, hey, what's up, man? They're usually referring to the Septuagint whenever they refer to the Bible. We don't just know that because it is in Greek, but because, you know, translations are never perfect. They're great. People are good at translating, but translations are never perfect. By the way, Asher, just for transparency, I just want to let you know that this is recording all around. So I just didn't want you to be on video and not be aware. So just want to make sure you knew. The translations are never perfect. So, and we can tell that they're usually quoting the Septuagint rather than translating the Hebrew Bible. And these texts were all written by the original followers of Jesus. And so we'll get a little bit more into that in a second. Structure of the New Testament. There are 5 sections. So this will be on the test. We'll just make that clear. If you go Google how many sections of the New Testament are there, you'll get several different answers because there are different ways you can break it up. This is the way that I want it broken up. There are the Gospels, the 4 Gospels we've been talking about, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Acts, which is just a single book, the book of Acts. Pauline epistles, there are 14 epistles attributed to Paul. Paul is, so in the book of Acts, we'll go into that. Just know that there's a guy named Paul, and he wrote some letters. Epistle is just another way to write the word letter. I don't know why they call it that really, but, and you're fine if you just write Pauline letters. Letters is perfectly acceptable. Catholic epistles or Catholic letters. And I've talked about this before. Remember, the word Catholic is just the word, it's the Latin word for universal. So it doesn't mean Roman Catholic. It doesn't mean the denomination Catholic as opposed to Baptist and Presbyterian and all that. It means universal. And so these were letters that were actually they were just written by other people. So you could even call it non-Pauline epistles. So there's the letters that were written by Paul, the letters that were written by people other than Paul, and then the book of Revelation, which is its own section. So these are the 5 sections. This is how I would ask you to break it up. Again, there are other ways to break it up that are totally legitimate, but like the Bible Project actually put these together and these together whenever they split it up in their New Testament introduction, which is just fine. But that's how I would like it split up. So what are these 5 sections? The Gospels. A gospel, we talked a lot about this, why it has the name gospel. So I won't go into that right now. But it's in the style of a Greco-Roman biography. So the idea here is that it's telling a story of who Jesus is. Now, the reason I write Greco-Roman biography is because a Greco-Roman biography is a little bit different than what we would say. I've talked about this a little bit before. So if you were to pick up a biography of Martin Luther King, you would expect it to just be telling the story of his life. This is who he is, these are the things that he did, this is what his home life was like growing up. Now, if you were to buy another book that said Martin Luther King, modern day Messiah. Let's just go with that, right? You're to buy another book that said, Martin Luther King, and then the subtitle was Modern Day Messiah, and then in the bottom it said, a thematic telling of Martin Luther King's life. What it would do is what you'd be expecting is for it to be really foregrounding and emphasizing some things to tell a point. Maybe it's not going to talk so much about the school that you went to growing up, because that's not important to the story that they're trying to tell. Though I guess it probably would be with Martin Luther King. But anyway, I just say all that to say Greco-Roman biographies are meant to be more thematic. They're not just trying to tell you about a person, but they're trying to tell you, they're trying to communicate truths. That doesn't mean that they're false, right? There was still a high level of scrutiny with these, right? If you're writing in 40 CE about a person who just died 7 years ago and was obviously a pretty big deal, and you're telling blatant lies about their life, people are going to say, this is a blatant lie about this person's life. I was there. I saw the whole thing. And you would never gain any traction. So they are trying to do more than just tell facts, but there is still a high level of scrutiny as far as historicity. There are 2 sections of the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels. We've talked about this already. Mark was probably written first. Some people do argue about this. Matthew and Luke seem to have used Mark as a source with some hypothetical, Q source. I put Q in quotations because we don't have a Q. There's no document that we say this is Q, where honestly, it's the same place where QAnon gets its name. Q just means like, it just means like a source that's out there that we don't actually like have tangibly. That it's theorized that it exists, but we don't actually know that it's there. I hope that QAnon reference doesn't distract too much, but, anyway, so yeah, some propose that there was a Q source. There are a lot of people who, just to let y'all know, that propose that Matthew was written first, that Luke used Matthew and maybe some other source, and that Mark is actually, instead of Matthew using Mark and expanding, that Mark is actually using Matthew and is chopping away, is just trying to simplify it. That's a less common view, but it's out there. And then there is the Gospel of John, which will often just be called the fourth gospel. People will call it that. You know, I couldn't really tell you why, but it is often just called the fourth gospel. Written much later. So Mark was probably written 50s, maybe 60s. Matthew and Luke then written sometime in the 70s. Actually, probably after 70, but sometime after 70, and whereas John was written more than likely in the early 90s, which let's just do some math here. So John was one of Jesus's disciples. So that means probably a little bit younger than Jesus. Definitely not older, or at least not significantly older, but around the same age, if not, but probably a little bit younger than Jesus. So Jesus died whenever he was 30 years old in the year 33. Okay. Let's just say that John was 18. So if he's 18 in the year 33, and now it's the year 90, that would make him, what does that make him? Almost 80 years old. Yeah, 78 years old, 80 years old. John is an old man, which is actually, there's a lot of other historical accounts that corroborate that, you know, John is an old man writing this. So written much, much later, and it's got a very different tone, a much more theological tone. So again, I put this in quotations. John is definitely not, well, actually, I'll go ahead and put the last part. His chronology of events is very unique. Sorry, he has a different chronology, so the events happen in different orders, and then he's got some very unique events that happen only in his gospel that you don't see in any of the other three. Now, each of them have events that happen only in their gospel, but John's is just very, very different. Probably the most important one, and we're not going to go over this in class at all, but if you're ever interested in it, it's a great text. It's called the High Priestly Prayer. And it's this really long prayer that Jesus does right before, I can't remember if it's right before he enters Jerusalem or if it's right after he enters Jerusalem, which he's only there for a week. But it's this really long prayer for his followers, for the people who would come. It's a really beautiful prayer. It's all about the sending of the Holy Spirit, which is what we're going to talk about in the next class. But just a really, really great prayer. But John, written much later and much more theological with the way that he's telling the story. The book of Acts then. So Acts is Luke volume 2, which is the reason why you'll often hear it called Luke Acts. In the Bible Project, they have Luke Acts as a video series. One that I really wish I had y'all watch, and y'all will watch some of it. But so the same person who wrote Luke, or at least ostensibly, the same person who wrote Luke wrote Acts, and it's clearly written to be a part 2, which means Luke doesn't believe that the story is over even with the resurrection of Jesus. It's very clear that as he's writing, as he's writing Acts, especially, that he believes that this is a continuation of the story. The same reason that you would write a volume 1, volume 2 now, right? You know, you write Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. There's a reason you don't include all the stuff about, you don't just make it one long book that, is this big. So But what it is generically about is the birth of the church. If you were to define Acts, so someone were to ask you that same question about the New Testament, but were to say, what is the book of Acts? You say, oh, it's the story of the birth of the church. That is the one sentence definition. It starts with the sending or the receiving of the Holy Spirit, and it tells. Yes. So I'm going to actually augment this one right here a little bit. But chapter 1 through 8, this is fine. So it's all about the apostles' ministry to the Jews / Israel. Let me just pause here. Whenever I say Jews / Israel, why do I make that distinction? So remember the Jews in at the end of Second Kings, that the people of Israel split. And there's the southern kingdom, which is mostly just the Judea, which is where we get the word Jews from. That's where the Jewish people get their name, Judea. Israel then is actually what they call the northern kingdom, which is thought of as the less faithful kingdom. And Israel also is the one that, as far as dispersing goes, there was just a lot more of Israel. I mean, the Jews did as well, but Israel like leaving the actual land of Palestine / modern day Israel. And so Acts 1 in the first chapter, it starts with Jesus actually coming back down, and he says to his disciples, you will be my witness in Jerusalem, Judea, and in all of Samaria, and in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and in all of the world. This is an intentional 3-part. So Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria. So Samaria, Israel, the northern kingdoms, sometimes called Ephraim, all the different names for basically the Jews who are wanton, who are straying. So you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, and then in the rest of the world. Acts 1 through 8 is about the Jerusalem and the Judea and Samaria part. It's all about the gathering of God's people, the Jews and the Israelites, into God's new covenant, which is now defined by faith, the Christ faith. Then in chapter 9, we get the conversion of Paul. So it's a guy named Saul, actually, Saul. And whenever he becomes a Christian, God gives him a new name, Paul. There are lots of speculations why. None of them are actually very clear, but for some reason he gets a new name. So now his name is Paul, and Paul actually tells him, we'll get into Acts. So I don't want to go into it now. We don't have that. And so then the rest of Acts is about Paul's ministry to the Gentiles. So Gentile just means not Jewish. In Jewish sociology, there are 2 people groups, the Jews and the Gentiles. You're either a Jew or you're a Gentile. And so Paul's ministry to the Gentiles. If you Google it, 9 through 28 is going to be talked about as a single section, which is correct. But it just 9 is specifically the conversion of Paul, which we'll get into next class. So then we have the Pauline epistles. You don't have to write all these down there in your Bibles, but note that they are ordered by length. This is important. A lot of people, I mean, rightly so, right? They think that it's called 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians because 1 Corinthians was written first and 2 Corinthians was written second. Same thing with Thessalonians. That 1 Thessalonians was written first and then 2 Thessalonians was written second. Now, it does so happen that most people do actually order them in that way, but that's not why they're in this order. They're ordered by length. In fact, y'all remember, how old were y'all in 2016? What, like 11? I don't know if y'all are old enough to really be paying attention to what Donald Trump was doing, but y'all remember whenever, I think it was 2016, it might have been before then even, but whenever he talked about, I think he talked about 1 Corinthians and everybody roasted him for it. Don't remember that at all? He was at Liberty University, and he was doing some presentation, and like whenever he like read from what we would usually call 1 Corinthians, because most people would say 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, he said 1 Corinthians. And people on Twitter were just roasting him, like, look at this idiot, like, this guy, you know. This is not me disagreeing necessarily, but well, I'm being recorded. Anyway, what's funny actually is that really now what's more common is in at least in academic circles is that we all refer to it as 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, because you want to not have the you don't want to be misleading and think that you're trying to say that I'm calling it 1 Corinthians because it was written first. Going too deep into this. By the way, I have these two split up for a reason that I will show you in a second. So the Catholic epistles, remember Catholic again, just means universal, not Roman Catholic. Also called the general epistles. All of them are named for their author, except for the book of Hebrews. So it's Hebrews through Jude, and they're all written for their author. And these books, so again, unknown author. This is James, the brother of Jesus. Simon Peter, who is also called Cephas sometimes. Some people pronounce it Cephas, but it's pronounced Cephas. Actually, it's pronounced Cephas, but I won't make you do that. John the Elder. I only write this out because John the Elder might not be the same person. Most people really don't think it's the same person as John who wrote the Gospel of John. But it could be. Traditionally, it is attributed to him, but most people now don't think that. And then Jude, who is also another brother of Jesus. And then finally, the book of Revelation. Revelation, single, not Revelations. Oh man, nails on the chalkboard over here. Written by John the Seer. Again, like traditionally, it's been attributed to the same John who wrote the Gospel of John and 1st through 3rd John. But most people now would say that it's a different person. But regardless, we're going to call him John the Seer. So what is he saying? Revelation fits within this type of literature called apocalyptic literature. And we hear the word apocalypse and we think like the world is going to end, you know, that a meteor is coming down and things like that. But apocalyptic, it's a Greek word, apa, which is out of, and kalypsis, which is hiding. And so apocalypse is literally means out of hiding, the thing that it's coming out of hiding. So i.e. it's a revelation of a hidden message. So it's not about the end of the world. The book draws heavily on Daniel and Ezekiel, and it depicts the second coming of Christ and new creation. Probably what a lot of y'all are familiar with on a popular level, at least, is a thing called dispensationalism, which got really big in like the 50s, and taught that, you know, this is where you'll hear about like the 1,000-year reign of Christ, sometimes called the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and you know, are Christians going to be raptured, which means, you know, taken up out of the world before the tribulation, or are they going to be taken up out of the world after the tribulation? Are we going to have to endure it during the tribulation? When are we? And a lot of this really comes out in the 50s and has taken hold, where people think that this is the normative Christian belief. Even Christians believe that this is the normative Christian belief. And it was not until the 50s. Nobody talked about this, you know, end of the world coming prophecies that like, you know, all of a sudden, like what are the signs that, you know, Jesus is coming back and he's going to destroy all the world, and all this sort of stuff was not a thing before the 20th century, before the 19th century, at least. this is, what Revelation is about, though, is about God restoring the world back to what it was before, human sin and before sin entered the world. Yeah. We'll talk a lot about that. A lot of people are interested in it, so we'll actually talk about it. So let me just talk for a second about textual criticism. So what is it? Text criticism is criticizing the text. Mind blown. Very, very scholarly definition there. But more specifically, what is it? So it's dating, not dating one another, but like dating books of the New Testament. So when were they written? How do we know? Because people, back then didn't write that it was 40 CE because they didn't think about the world in those kind of times. Anyway, authorship, who actually wrote them? This says that Paul wrote it, but how do we actually know that? Alignment with history. Do the events that are talked about in this text align with actual history? Like, do we have evidence of this being a thing that could have happened? Jesus of Nazareth, for example, how do we know he existed? How do we know that this wasn't just a mythical figure that people made up? Actually, a really interesting, so Josephus, who's a Jew, so he was not a Christian, he was not a Jewish Christian, but he was Jewish. And he was a writer and a historian who lived, who was probably born around the time Jesus died. He actually, in one of his histories, he's got just a big book called The History. He talks about Jesus of Nazareth. It seems very certain that there was a man in Judea around what we call the beginning of the first century, who claimed to be the Messiah. People thought that he was the Messiah, and because of that, he was crucified. That is a historical fact that is not really, you can't really argue with that. I mean, you can, people do, but even in non-confessional circles, the fact that there was a man who claimed to be the Messiah and was killed for it, his name was Jesus, that's not really something people debate. Now what people debate is, did he rise from the dead? That's where the debate comes in. But anyway, and then finally what they do is, what text criticism is the redaction process. So were there additions or subtractions to the text that might have happened after it was originally written. We get started a little late. I know that we got to go to chapel, but there's not much more. So if you'll allow me. So this is the redaction part of it. So let's talk about 1 John 5. So if you go into your Bibles in 1 John 5:7, probably the part that's in these double brackets right here just won't be in there, but they might be. And if they are, they'll have a footnote down at the bottom that says that more reliable manuscripts don't include this. And so there are three that testify, and then all of a sudden someone has put in later, in heaven, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, or the Word and the Holy Spirit. And these are three in one. And then there are three that testify on earth, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these three agree. So originally it just was three that testify, the Spirit, the water, and the blood. The idea here is that later Christians added this in here to be a good statement of the Trinity. Now, this doesn't mean that the Trinity is false. In fact, what this shows us is that Christians believed in the Trinity and from other sources, and so then wanted to put something explicitly in the Bibles. But we, through a lot of processes, are able to determine that this wasn't originally there. John 8, the beginning of John 8 specifically, it's actually the last verse of John 7, and then the first 11 verses of John 8, which is the story of the woman caught in adultery. It's actually a pretty popular story in pop culture. A woman caught in adultery. The people are going to stone her to death. Jesus walks up and says, "What's going on?" "Oh, she was caught in adultery. We're going to stone her to death." And so he draws a line in the sand, and then he says, he writes in the sand. That's what it is. he writes in the sand, we don't know what, and then he says, let he who is without sin throw the first stone. No, and it says that they all put down their stones and left, and he says, has anybody condemned you? Neither do I. It's a really beautiful story, but most people don't think that John wrote it. Now with John 8 specifically, a lot of people actually think that it is a true story, that it was actually a story of Jesus. It just wasn't one that John wrote down. It was one that was later written down and added in there as an addition. Mark 14, the very end of Mark. So we'll talk about this more in our next class, but so in Mark 14 is the last chapter of Mark. At the end of Mark, so the women find Jesus, and Jesus says, go tell everybody. And then the women, and then it says that the women went away and were scared. And then Mark put a period and put down his pen and said, wow, that's a great story. And he walked away and he never wrote another word. It's very jarring. It's this odd, why would you end it like that? Especially Mark, you know that there was more that happened after this. You know that there was the entire birth of a church. You know that they actually did end up going to tell people, and that people celebrated it. But Mark, for a lot of reasons, probably ended his gospel very abruptly. And early Christians didn't like that. And so there's a very early tradition of adding some more information to the end of Mark that makes it a little bit less stark. But with these two specifically, if you open up any Bible, they will have these two in there, but it will be very, very clearly marked off as not in the original manuscripts. I guess I should talk about manuscripts real quick. So people that something like this will bring up with people like, well, how can we trust the Bible if there's all these variations and stuff like that? We think about these manuscripts the same way that people talk about like the telephone game, you know what I'm talking about, where like I like whisper something to Caroline and she whispers it to Londo, whispers it to Asher, and then by the time it gets back to me, it's a totally different message. People talk about it as if it's like that. But that's because we don't think about the difference in the world. So a sheet of paper for us, right? We write on it and maybe we decide we don't want it anymore and we throw it away. A sheet of paper for them would have cost an incredible amount of money. Whenever I'm thinking incredible amounts of money, I can't remember, and I'll find this and bring it to the next class actually. But the book of Romans, for example, which is Paul's longest letter, would have taken, in modern terms, thousands of dollars to write a single copy of it. Now, if you were going to pay somebody to write a letter for you, and that letter was going to cost you thousands of dollars to write, well, let's say you were going to pay somebody to copy it, right? So Paul writes his original, and then you're going to pay somebody to copy it. Or if you're the one paying for it and you're the one doing the copying, how careful do you think you're going to be? This is an extremely professional skill that has just fallen off because now everybody's literate and writing materials are abundant, right? But this is an extremely professional skill that took an incredible amount of training to be able to do well. And so so there are just variations in these manuscripts. You know, we have something like 5,000 manuscripts from the New Testament, which is an incredible amount compared to any other work of literature in that time. In fact, even whenever we talk about Plato or Herod, Herod's probably a bad example, but I mean, we don't have that many examples of Herod either. It's a tiny fraction of the number of manuscripts that we have of the New Testament, and there's really not a ton of significant variation. You've got this, you got this, you got this one verse, which this is actually really easily explainable. It didn't come about until like the 4th century, 5th century. It's never in Greek at all, actually. So we, you know, like you got these 2 examples that are fairly large, but, anyway, all that to say, people love to talk a lot about how we don't have the original manuscripts of the Bible, and because, you know, and it's not reliable because, you know, there's all these variations and stuff like that, but, anyway, maybe we can talk about that more another time. I'm just gonna run through this quickly because we don't have time, but, so then there's the question of authorship, which is most, distinct with Paul. So Paul has 14 letters attributed to him, but they're usually broken up into 3 categories. The 7 genuine Paulines, which are the ones that everybody, for the most part, believes are written by Paul. And so those are the ones that I have in bold. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, all the way to Philemon. Then there's the Deuteropaulines, which some people think that they weren't written by Paul. Some people think that they were. They kind of go in, actually, let me go ahead and put this up. Some people think that they were, oh shoot, this is supposed to be 2 Thessalonians. So most people still think 2 Thessalonians is written by Paul, but there's a little bit more discrepancy there. You know, a little bit less certain about Colossians, but still pretty certain. And then Ephesians is we're, you know, just a little bit more uncertain. So, but these are called the Deuteropaulines, called so because people typically think that one of Paul's direct disciples probably wrote them. But then there's the pastorals, which is 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, which you're going to have a large swath of even conservative Christians, meaning like Bible. Oh, I got it in the Zoom meeting. Bible believing Christians who don't believe that those were actually written by Paul. All right.